that you're talking about are not just, issues within Judaism. They're virginity, for example, is another issue of how we, as a society, as a system, keep women's sexuality imprisoned, right? And that women do not have control or say or power over their own sexuality. And that includes, of course, what you're talking about, which is menstruation and how that is seen as unclean. So yes, there is a connection to all of these issues that are about the disempowerment and control of women and women's bodies.
What's interesting to me is that 98% of human history were hunters and gatherers, and from what I've read, they were fairly egalitarian. People would pass the children around, women would help with net hunting, and maybe the elders had more authority, but it was because they were elders, not because they were male or female. So I think Marx says that the change to patriarchy comes when people settle because of agriculture. And then being settled, you have bigger places, you need more defense, and then that brings in the patriarchy. What's your understanding of the origins? Why are we now?
I have a similar understanding that from what we know about hunter-gatherer societies, right? As long as you are able to go on the hunt, you were able to go on the hunt, no matter what your gender, right? But that gatherers were people who had to take care of children, right? And so you can gather vegetables, fruits, roots, seeds, while you were still able to move around with children. And that could be, with men or women, taking care of children. So basically, it was divided by task, but not by equality, because everyone brought their the product of their search, of their pursuit to the collective. My understanding, and we know this also from archaeological information, that before agriculture, societies were goddess worshippers.
The Venus figurines, the little fertility figures.
That's right. So the figurines that showed women in various states of fecundity, right? So it was, it was Mother Earth. She was the creator. Life came out of the female, and females, women, were seen as the creators, as the creative force. What changed with agriculture was that, and we also see this in the change in religion, right? That we go from female worshiping to male worshiping, right? And that the whole creation story gets upended, right? Where rather than man or boys, the males coming out of females, it's females coming out of males. Right, so Athena comes out of Zeus's head.
Adam from the rib.
Eve, right? Yeah. Eve comes out of Adam's rib, right? So it changes the narrative. It changes the story of creation. Man becomes the creative force, and I think that is because of agriculture, right? Where now you can't, as you said, you're no longer nomadic. In order to protect a harvest, you have to stay still. You have to stay in place in order to plant and, caretake, husband, right, your property, your crop, and then, reap it, right? And so that takes time. So you have to protect a piece of land against marauders, against anything that would come and destroy your crop. And so this whole idea of defending your land, and it changes the narrative where now a man is the creator. He's the creative force. He is the one who plants the seeds into the earth, right? So So now he is the one who plants the seed into the woman, right? So she becomes the dirt in which he plants his seed, right? And therefore, if the land is now in his ownership, she is now in his ownership, right? Because he is in control of his seed and the product of, his seed, right? Which is now transferred to women as earth, as property, and what comes of her womb is his.
I think I read that for maybe ancient Greeks, they didn't think that the woman really made a part in conception. It was all the male was the conceiver, and she was just
Right.
like you say the field for the growth. I don't remember exactly, but it was something like that.
Right. That actually was the prevailing, thought through the Middle Ages into modern time. It was the idea of the homunculus, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Which is that, that the sperm, in a sense, already has a fully formed, very tiny human, and that's implanted in her, right? Let's incubator.
Right.
and is given birth fully formed in that way.
This makes me think there is a neo-Freudian, Karen Horney, and she said, as you may know, that what's really going on is womb envy, that early people didn't know that men played a part in reproduction. Women do these miraculous things, bleed, and they're not wounded, give birth to life. And so that there's kind of a womb envy, the priests wearing dresses and doing things with vessels of water and that kind of thing. That seems like an intriguing idea.
Well, I think it's probably a result of Freud's idea of penis envy, right? So it's just another, point of view. I don't think that ancient peoples did not understand procreation, right? If they were, if they had, tamed animals and they bred animals, they were observant. If they could, survey the stars and time, why couldn't they make the connection between,
intercourse and pregnancy.
Intercourse and reproduction.
And I think even hunters and gatherers had dogs. I think dogs came pretty early, so they could see the dogs have puppies and whatever. In terms of patriarchy, it seems like Trump was the epitome of everything negative about it. And there are so many people, millions of people who love him. It's like a cult. So I'm really interested, do you think that that's the last gasp of the patriarchy, kind of all the negativity coming to the surface? Or do you think, no, patriarchy is entrenched and Trump is evidence of that?
Well, I believe the latter. I believe that patriarchy is entrenched and Trump is just another reiteration of that. We see this, of course, happening across the world, right? In many countries, that right-wing movement towards maintaining men's power and control. So we see it in Hungary, we see it in Poland, we see it in the Brexit movements,
Russia,
right?
China, Brazil.
That's right, exactly. We see it all over the world, and I think that is the backlash, right? That is the backlash against the feminist movement. It's the backlash against LGBTQ civil rights. It's the backlash against, civil rights for BIPOC people, for people of color, right? Whenever the other, whoever is othered, tries to gain some liberation and freedom, the forces and powers see that as a threat, right? Trump is the representation of that fear, right?
Mm.
By white male supremacy, right? White male America, in this case, responding to their perception of a threat, of their power, their control being taken away, right? So it looks like anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBTQ, anti-woman, anything that is a threat to male power, especially in this country, white male power, is going to be, there's going to be a response, as we have seen with the Trump administration.
Now, what about the fact that the majority of white women voted for Trump both election cycles? What's in it for women to vote for him? That I don't understand.
Well, the way I understood it, and I actually wrote an article about that on the organization that the nonprofit that I run, NOMAS, the National Organization for Men Against Sexism. And I believe that that majority of white women did not vote for their gender, they voted for their race.
Oh.
So they chose racial superiority over their own gender issues.
I mean, it's just so astounding that he could say, because I'm a star, I can grab women's genitalia, or I can have unprotected sex with a porn star after my third wife gives birth. I mean, they're just so astoundingly, like, it would be so offensive to any woman. I can't imagine anybody voting for him.
Well, but my analysis of that is just because you're a woman in patriarchy does not mean that you are somehow inherently going to be a feminist, right? What it means is that the impact of patriarchy, of male supremacy, is that women buy into the system. We've all been indoctrinated from birth, right? And women have been rewarded for certain roles that they've, that they've been taught to play out. And so if you understand that in patriarchy, a majority of women are going to be male identified. They're going to be identifying with the system in which they have existed, to which they have been born. So, the feminism requires consciousness raising, right? That was the movement in the 60s and 70s of women's consciousness raising, right? But if you don't do that work of understanding that you are part of a system, that you breathe and live and eat and smell and whatever that system, that it becomes a part of you. It's your indoctrination. I tell my clients that when you're born, right, you get a download, right? Girls get the pink download and boys get the blue download, and that's your world view. And so just because you're a woman doesn't mean that your world view is any different unless you've done the work to raise your own consciousness and awareness of what happens to you when you are a part of that system.
I interviewed John Stoltenberg, and he quoted Andrea Dworkin as saying that women looked for one man as a protector from the patriarchal system, and so they vote in terms of, I want to vote the way my husband tells me because he protects me.
That's right. I totally believe in what John Stoltenberg is saying. And again, that's part of the indoctrination that everyone experiences in patriarchy. So I believe that all women are terrorized in a patriarchy, that women walk in unsafety. From childhood, all girls and women are taught to be afraid of who? Who are women afraid of? When women walk down the street,
big men.
They're afraid of men, right?
Big
and
ones.
so they're afraid of all men, and when you ask, when I ask men, who are you afraid of walking down the street? They will say the same thing. We're afraid of men. So men are seen as the perpetrators of violence, and not just seen, but experienced. Right? We know that 3 out of 4 women will experience some kind of violence or sexual assault in their lifetimes, whereas and 1 in 4 men will experience that, but the perpetrators are predominantly going to be men. They're going to be males. So we live in a society that already tells women that they cannot protect themselves, and so that they need a man to protect them from other men.
What women are told is carry your keys in your knuckles as kind of a weapon, or carry
That's right.
That, what do you call that fluid that you spray at people? Mace. That right. So yeah.
Right.
So
that's right. So the onus of protection is, for her to find protection is on her. She has to find protection from a man. We don't teach men to not harm women. We don't teach men not to be violent, because that would be anti-patriarchal, right? So the onus of protection falls on women, and then women are taught to look for a man to protect them, right? Whether it's financially, because we set it up for women to only make 70 cents on the dollar, whether it's physically, right, to protect them from other men. In all kinds of ways, women are handicapped in this system so that they will require the protection of a man, so that they will have to be, by default, subordinate to that protector.
What's so interesting is that women, especially young girls, are increasingly sexualized. So you should be sexy even when you're a little girl. But then when women are raped or assaulted, they're told, oh, but you revealed so much skin, what do you expect? So it's you can't win.
That's right. It's a no-win situation, right? We live in rape culture, right? We live in a culture that colludes with, perpetuates with, in policy, in culture, in roles. We perpetuate a system of rape and violence against women, and then expect women to do the job of protecting themselves.
Well, pornography is probably the most injurious influence, don't you think, on our sexuality? If they and romance novels, they had bodice rippers where the hero rips her bodice off and she's so passionate and falls in love with him. So it's since the 19th century there's been this strange association of violence and passion and sexual intensity. It's really sick.
Right, and again, that is the ways in which that system creates a narrative, a story that places women into certain roles, right? And most of those narratives were not created by women. Or if they were created by women, they were created by women for a patriarchal audience, right? Again, it's those old archetypes of temptress and whore and all the ways in which women are put into a box, a category, from which men can then have a very simplified way of, looking at women without ever listening to women's voices.
And then the other side of that is you should be Mary-like, be a virgin. So women are either the sexual temptress or they're the asexual, pure purities or lack of sexuality.
Right, that's the mother whore complex, right? So her sexual identity is split, right? She's either split into the whore or the mother, but she can't be both, right? So when she's unattached, her role is to attract a man, and therefore she's the whore, right? She's supposed to be
the temptress.
The temptress, right? If she attracts a man and he marries her, then she has to become the mother, as you said, asexual and caretaker, caregiver, right? And so women can't, can't live in an identification of their own sexuality. Their sexuality is defined for them by that patriarchal culture, by men, right? She's only there as to attract who? To attract a man. He gets to define whether she is valuable and attractive. And as a mother, right, she is again only identified by who she is married to, by her husband, right? She gives up her last name, right? She becomes Mrs. John Smith, right? So either way, it's a system that sets women up to not have their own identification, or no matter what that is, right? But that her identification comes from men. Her value comes from her status and relationship to men.
I think there are Middle Eastern cultures where the woman is known as mother of the son. That's right. Her name. You refer to, I don't remember which country in the Middle East, but she's mother of John, right, or Mohammed, or whatever it is.
Right.
How do you see this play out in your patients, especially ones who come to you for sex therapy? Are they inhibited by these mythologies, or what do you see as patterns and why people come to you with sexual dilemmas?
Okay, so let me just kind of backtrack a minute, because I don't think we've talked about, my career or what I do. I am a sex therapist, but also trauma therapist. In Denver, Colorado, I have a private practice. And what I think is really important for me, not just as a man, but as a therapist, is that I bring my feminist perspective into my work. Right? I do not see a separation between, in a sense, my awareness, my politics, my feminism, my work for social justice as separate from my therapeutic, work, my perspective. So I actually tell my clients at every first session that I have with a new client that is my perspective. That I don't just see you, whoever that client is, as someone who is what I call a unicorn, right? That somebody who has very specific, unique issues that are only embedded in your history or your upbringing. That no one comes out alive out of our system without having been impacted. So if I'm working with a female client, I cannot separate her experience and her existence from what it means to be a female in patriarchy, who has experienced sexism and misogyny and all forms of prejudice and bias and discrimination because she is a woman, right? And I tell this to my male clients too, right? That no man is, without having, been indoctrinated into that system. That every institution that all of us interact with are going to be patriarchal. They're going to be male-dominated, male-centered, and male-identified. And so that men carry the impact, right, of that indoctrination in their psyche, in their behavior, and in their history. So no one is immune. And so that's my starting point, right?
So in terms of their sexual issues, are there patterns in what's problematic?
Yes, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in business.
What are the lack of sexual desire, lack of ability to have an orgasm? I don't know why. What do people say they want help with?
Well, so I see clients for various issues of within that uh, range of sexuality and um, not just sexual orientation or sexual function or expression, but very much these days, kind of following your comment about pornography, also sexual addiction. I think about a quarter of my practice involves people, men especially, who come to me for issues of sexual addiction. But to answer your question, sexuality is not, again, separate or immune from patriarchal indoctrination and patriarchal narratives. Like you said, from romance novels, from pornography, from movies, from all of the media, all of us get internalize of messages about who we are as sexual beings that become ways in which we show up sexually. In this modern era of the internet, there is, children as young. I see adults who have been exposed to pornography as young as 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. So their sexuality is wired, right, to the material that they've been exposed to. They see themselves, through the lens of the pornography that they've been exposed to. And most pornography, as someone in the feminist movement said, is basically filmed rape of women, at least heterosexual pornography, right? And so if you're seeing your sexuality as involving the denigration or the perpetration of women as something that is acceptable, then that is going to translate into how you do sex. And that's going to impact women, girls and women as well, because now their sexuality is portrayed in this system, right? So men will come to women in their lives asking for, the manifestation of that visualized, encounters that are seen in pornography. So we know that a lot of girls across the world in their teens are experiencing lots of pressure for all kinds of sexual acts in order for them to be acceptable by boys or the men that they're encountering. We see an uptick in choking. We see an uptick in all kinds of sexualized violence against women. All kinds of, and I'm not going to quote all the research right now. What I see in my practice is that issues, most predominantly in men, is performance anxiety, right? So the narrative of male sexuality is perpetuated through pornography, but it's also perpetuated in all sorts of media, right, that tell men who they should be and how they should perform. I tell my clients, if I had a T-shirt for my practice, it would be "Sex is not a performance," right? Because that's what happens. And that's what has happened, is that sex has become a performance. It's become another role. It's become another have to. And so another place of no choice, right? So therefore another place of limitation. So men and women come to sex, or as I say, they walk into the bedroom, right, with a whole set of expectations and roles that then limit who they are authentically, right, and limit their ability to actually ask for what they want, to communicate about who they are as sexual beings, right, and so that's going to create havoc, right, in people's sex lives. Right? Men leave sex in droves because of erectile dysfunction, because they can't perform. Women leave sex because of painful intercourse, because sex becomes painful, right? And neither one has been taught, right, that sex is not about performance, that sex is not about intercourse.
With the erectile dysfunction, is it mostly, well, it's like there was a chapter in Herb Goldberg's book, The Hazards of Being Male, called The Wisdom of the Penis. And he said, if you don't have an erection, you need to look at what's the emotional milieu in which you're not getting an erection. It's not just like a machine that you push a button and you get an erection. There's a context.
That's right. And the context is the mind, right? There is no sex without, the desire that exists in the mind, right? The body is only responding to the limitations or liberation of the mind. So if you have been indoctrinated into a system that says to a woman, you can't want sex, you can't, look for sex, otherwise you will be what? Right?
A whore, yeah.
A whore, a slut, right?
Slut.
And so, right? Then how is that going to impact, how you show up sexually? If all the messages that you've received about who you are as a sexual being, right, is that you should not want sex, and that you should only have the sex that pleases your man, right? Then who are you as a sexual being? And on the other side of that, if you're a man and all you've been taught all your life is that, it's all about you and your penis, right? How is that going to show up in the depth of connection you desire from another person, with another person?
What do you think about these women? I guess it's rap stars that Megan Thee Stallion and with another woman, they did something about wet pussy that it was so vulgar. It was just the extreme of all the good girl messages. What do you think's going on there? I mean, they're really pretty vulgar songs to me. And
well, I'm not familiar with those, but I certainly believe in guerrilla theater, and if that's what that is, right, as a way to, kind of say screw you to the system, we have a lot of that in the history of feminism. That's what bra burning was about. That's what, it's a way to say,
we're independent.
Yeah.
Let's go back to your origin. So you were born in Israel. What brought your family to the States? What was that story?
So both my parents were Holocaust survivors. So they survived, they survived a genocide against our people, and most specifically our family, right? 30 members, immediate members of my family were killed, were murdered. My parents were, the lucky ones who survived. They met in a refugee camp after the war um, in British-occupied Germany. They were Polish-born, and they. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but they managed to immigrate to pre-independence, Israel, which was then British-occupied Palestine. And I was born there, and I have an older brother. And I think one of the, not the only, but the major impetus for them leaving Israel was that they were not willing to lose any more family members. They were trying to protect their sons.
Epigenetics says that our traumas and emotional states can get passed on genetically, and that our environment says this gene should be expressed and not this one. So I'm wondering if you find that the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors carry this kind of miasm or shadow of trauma, and that's something that has to be dealt with.
The answer is yes. I don't know that it's wholly epigenetic, because we have lived with those parents, right? Our daily life was with those parents. So it's not just what was passed on to us epigenetically, that is, as a result of gene expression that comes out of trauma and anxiety, but it's also daily life with these people, these humans who are traumatized, right? Who live the rest of their lives in their traumas, right? I mean, I had a father who would wake up with nightmares, screaming. I mean, I was the child in the other room listening to those screams, and, that had an impact, the stories, right, around the dinner table. That had an impact that I cannot separate, from what was passed on potentially via epigenetics. So all, trauma is intergenerational. Whether it's epigenetic or not, it is passed through the behaviors.
Yeah.
Right? So we cannot look at African American, community today without, saying that the people now are not impacted by the trauma of slavery, right? Because it's passed on, from parents to children. All children internalize, right, the experience of being in the presence of their parents. Parental wounding is the legacy of all children, and all children will pass on that wounding to their children unless they do the healing work that is required to make their lives.
That's why I like Harville Hendricks' book, How to Get the Love You Want, because he addresses how to do the exercises and thinking and thought processes to heal some of those wounds from our childhood. Yeah. How old were you when you came to the States?
9 years old.
Do you remember Israel at all?
I do. A lot.
Well,
yeah,
did you?
I was in third grade when we left.
Oh yeah. What was the culture shock when you? What state did you come to? Colorado?
No, I came to California, to Los Angeles.
What was the culture shock when you came to LA?
I think the biggest culture shock for me was being separated from my family, my attachment objects. I had all the surviving members of my family ended up in the same town in Israel. So, thereabouts. And so I grew up with cousins and aunts and uncles and, everyone who survived. We were a very, close-knit family. And so that was the biggest culture shock, the sense of isolation and alienation, right? Because this was not my culture. I had to learn a new language.
So your parents spoke Polish and then Hebrew at home?
My parents, my mom spoke 6 languages. So my parents spoke Polish and Russian and Yiddish and Hebrew, and they learned English. At home, it was mostly Yiddish and Hebrew.
Do you think that background was what led you to be a therapist? But for 20 years, you did other work that wasn't therapy.
Right. I have a Ph.D. in cell biology. I was a research scientist for about 20 years. So, yeah.
Why did you switch from biologist to therapist?
A number of reasons, but I think mostly because of that history, my history, I did have an early identification with movements towards liberation, with civil rights movements, with the feminist movement. And actually, the one of the key moments of my life was reading a book by Susan Brown Miller in high school called Against Our Will, which was a treatise about rape. And I decided then and there, right, that I will not be part of a group, right, part of that gender that perpetuates the violence against women, and that really started my life of activism. So I was in research and in science for 20 years, and part of that was that part of why I left was that it was just another patriarchal institution, very heavily male-dominated. And even though I loved the work, I loved the science, I did not love the system. And so I decided to pursue another career in psychotherapy, in a sense as a way for me to do healing work, do systemic healing work, rather than on a political arena or what I say is one person at a time. So
that makes sense.
That I can create change. I can support change one person at a time, and hopefully that will translate to ultimately changing the system.
Be the change that you want to see. Yeah.
Right.
You have a son and a daughter?
I do.
And what have you learned from being a father?
Well, so I have to say, right, that I was not your usual American father, for one thing, right? As a pro-feminist man, my fathering was very different than even my own children. I remember my son at 16 saying, "Dad, why aren't you like other fathers?" And I was waiting for that question, right? I was going, well, David, thank you so much for noticing that, because, I want to give you another version of what it means to be a man, someone who is, nonviolent, someone who is affectionate, someone who is, who prioritizes, my children. And but from very early on, I was a feminist father. So I wanted to instill my children with an understanding of not just equality of all humans, but also that they are going to be encountering a system that will take choices away from them. So I would sit with my daughter and son watching, their shows, but I would be the
critic. I did that too.
Right, the critic or the.
Why are the main characters always boys? Why do they beat up on each other? How come the girl always asks a questioning inflection?
That's right. And what I also learned from that is that you cannot protect your children from patriarchy.
It's so true. No guns, right? But the sticks are guns.
That's right, exactly. And that, my children, especially my daughter, came out of her teens very much, impacted by, issues of, body, criticism, self-objectification, all the issues that I was, had hoped I could protect her from.
Of course.
But she still has, right, as an adult, she has this father whom she has as a role model for a different kind of man, right, as well as my son, right? And so, both my children are, feminists and activists, and they're amazing kids or adults.
Fabulous. I was a feminist mother raising a son, and he recently told my grandson, "Don't wear pink. Boys don't wear pink." Why not? If you like it, wear it. So the system is hard to beat.
That's right.
Because they go to school and they have friends and media.
That's right.
Did that relationship, that marriage, is that the one you're in now?
No.
What happened with that? I'm interested in what makes marriages work or not work over time.
Well, I've been married twice. The first time to a woman, and the second time to a man.
And is that why you decided not to, or whoever decided not to stay in the first marriage?
No, actually, I came out after my divorce.
In hindsight, could you have saved the first marriage?
I don't know that neither I or my ex were aware enough, and in those years, and we were in our 20s and 30s, and and from this place of having hindsight, we did what we knew, right? We did what we were told. We did what we believed, and we did what the system, the society told us to do. So, it takes time to accrue wisdom and understanding and awareness. Right. And I don't think we were ready for that then. And I was not ready. And, interestingly, right, one of the things that kept me from engaging in my sexual identity was my fear of men. We're all terrorized in this culture by male violence. And I could not imagine myself aligning myself with another man, even though I felt, the sexual orientation and attraction towards other men. I did not give myself permission to, attempt to engage in those possible relationships because I was terrified of male violence. Right?
So how were you able to overcome that fear with your husband?
Well, it happened way before I met my husband. So as you may recall, in the as a result of the feminist movement and consciousness raising groups in the late 80s and 90s, there was a time of men's consciousness raising groups. And so I, decided to go on a journey of learning how to trust men. And the only way I knew how to do that was to engage in these men's groups so that I could learn that men were trustworthy. And only after, going through that journey of trusting men did I give myself permission to go on a journey of my sexual identity formation, which is to, look for potential male relationships.
And some people say gay is role-less. Do you think it's easier to be egalitarian with a same-sex partner? More equal, more power sharing?
My first answer is yes, not because it's easier, because if you're already non-conforming to a heterosexist society, you're already questioning, other roles. And so I think it's part of the process of, choosing, right, an identity that's not prescribed, right? So then you can potentially challenge other roles and identities. But I don't believe that any relationship or any identity in patriarchy is role-less, right? Because roles, by definition, right, are the acts, the characters, the expectations that we embody in order to protect ourselves, right?
Or, there's mundane roles, like you're male, you mow the lawn. I'm female, I arrange the social events. So those are just mundane and make life easier sometimes.
Well, they make life easier because they are known. They make life easier because they're expected.
Familiar.
They're familiar. They don't make life easier in the sense that when we're not given a choice. So for me, liberation, empowerment is about choice. So roles, right, don't give us choice even though they appear easy.
Right, that's an excellent point. So how do you decide who does the cooking and the cleaning and the shopping and the bill paying in this marriage?
We discuss it. We communicate. We figure out what we like to do and what we don't like to do, and who gets to do that and share that. My husband, for example, loves mechanical things. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, anything that works via,
with a motor.
Yeah, and so, he gets to do that because that makes housework enjoyable for him, right? And I get to do other stuff that would be enjoyable for me.
What about stuff that's not enjoyable to anyone, like cleaning the toilets or something?
Well, I guess there are some things that just have to be done if you don't want a stinky toilet.
So do you share it, or do you hire it, or how do those things get done that nobody wants to do?
We just divide it up.
So it's even, Steven. How long have you been in this second marriage?
Married 5 years, together 17.
Ooh, wow. Okay, so the couples that I'm interviewing for the marriage book, I would say an issue for a fair amount of them is they lose interest in sex. They're happy to cuddle, they're happy to do things together and talk, but passionate sex seems like that was a decade ago. We've grown out of it or something. Do you have any suggestions for them? Because some of them would like to rekindle that.
Well, that's core to my work as a sex therapist, right? Unless something has medically or biochemically or physiologically challenges a person around their sexuality, or psychologically challenges a person around their sexuality, I believe that what you call passion, what I call desire, is maintained through our life, that it does not diminish. So anything that diminishes it, other than what we just talked about, physiologically, medically, psychologically, religious indoctrination, whatever, anything that otherwise takes away our desire or our passion is something that happens within the context of that relationship. That, in other words, that there is wounding, that there is some kind of mistrust built in the context of that relationship that makes sex not something that feels desirable, or that sex becomes a place of ongoing hurt or wounding or mistrust.
Well, what about boredom? Been there, done that. Blah, not interested, boring.
Well, so there it is, right? The core of sexual desire, and as you call passion, is communication. I believe in the potentiation of a sex life, right? And that requires work. And it is rare for two people to actually work on their sex life, to prioritize their sex life, to communicate about their needs and desires and anything, right? Because we live in a sex-negative culture, right? People don't talk about sex. People don't talk about their desires. People make assumptions based on what they've learned about what the other person wants, and they don't ask. They don't teach each other about who they are as sexual beings. And
maybe they don't know, especially the women.
Well, maybe, but that's not an excuse, right? Again, this is about consciousness raising. This is about awareness. This is about a healing journey. And that is also required of your sexuality and your sex life. We live in a culture that separates our sexuality from our humanity. It's as if it exists in a separate compartment, right? Behind closed doors, right? And so we do not usually have a healthy relationship with our sexuality because it's supposed to be something that we are divorced from, that only gets to happen, on a certain night or number of nights, whenever. And so when we don't own our sexuality, especially women, right, then how can we show up in our desire and our passions?
But these are couples who've had it, the passion, the desire, but then lose it. And not because of anything physiological. They, like I say, I think they just get bored. But you say then you have to work at it, and
that's right.
What does that mean?
So what you're talking about is what I call the infatuation setup. Right. So when two people meet in our modern world, right, unless you're living in a culture where marriages are arranged, right? In our world, in our culture, in the United States, or let's call it Western culture, people get together as a result of attraction, of chemistry. You are attracted to someone way before you ever know them, right? So so people get together as a result of what is called infatuation. It's a chemical reaction. It's a chemical bond, right? And that bond is, in a sense, comprises of physical and sexual and biochemical interactions, right? Oxytocin, vasopressin, norepinephrine, all the biochemicals of bonding and attachment that happens during the infatuation stage of every relationship, if it lasts longer than 18 months to 2 years. But that infatuation stage is a setup because we show up sexually during that infatuation even beyond our own libido level, right? Because we show up because it's exciting, it's new, and I want to show up for my partner who wants to have more sex than I do, right? So it sets it up at the early parts of the relationship that sex is highly erotic and passionate and desired and desirable, and we feel attractive and everything else. But that infatuation state has a limited time bandwidth.
Just
right?
neurochemically it does, yeah.
It does, right. Especially when people move in together and set up a household. Now you have to deal with the daily grind, the stressors, the work, the family, all the other issues. And then you have a child, or or you get a dog, or you buy a house, or whatever, right? And all those things start to erode, right, the investment in the sexual experience of that relationship, right? And people stop prioritizing their sex life and prioritizing other things. And so that boredom or malaise is a result of the natural life cycle of a relationship. And so the only way you can get to address that is to prioritize your sex life, your sexuality, your sexual relationship with a partner, right? So that it does not diminish.
So does that mean you read erotic novels together, or you do some kind of new place where you make love? Or what are some examples of things that people can do to nurture that?
Yes, all of the above. Anything that they are willing to explore in a consensual way with their partners and have the freedom to do that, to even speak it to each other and to explore it and to be curious about it. Right? I believe that that is possible, but again, that it takes work against the onslaught of everything else that happens to us as we grow in a relationship.
And I did a book called 50-50 Marriage and 50-50 Parenting was another one. And a lot of the couples said they had to leave the house. I mean, if even to go to a motel in town for the night, but to be romantic, they had to leave the phone and the chores or whatever.
Right. If that works, then great. All the power to them. Whatever works, right? But that is not possible for everybody, right? I mean, we're talking about socioeconomic issues, right? Not everybody can afford to go to a hotel room.
Yeah.
Right? But this model of I don't use the word passion in my work because I believe that it is a construct, a class construct. That the people who can afford to have a passionate marriage are wealthy enough to have somebody take care of their kids and their dogs, and they don't have to go to work, right? That they have the leisure and the wherewithal, the wealth to have, this spontaneous relationship, sexual relationship. Most working class, poor class, other classes don't have the capacity, right, to have this spontaneity that is often linked to this, version of passion. So as a sex therapist, I tell my clients, you have to create that spontaneity, right? But that spontaneity has to be created within a structured system that you're living in. So I say, schedule, at least 1 or 2 sex dates a week. What you do during that time and where you do it is going to be as spontaneous as you'd like, or not.
Does like going to dinner and a movie count as a sex date?
No.
Oh.
That's a date. That's a date. It's not a sex date. But what you do on a sex date is going to be, as spontaneous as you'd like it to be, but you are prioritizing it. In other words, you're making time in your busy life for this, connection, this, the glue of your bonded relationship. But again, we're not dealing with all the potential wounds that, sexual wounds that can happen in a relationship that, squash passion and desire. So if I have been betrayed in our relationship, if I have experienced wounding or violence, isolation, coercion, I might not be available as a sexual person in that relationship. So that, my primary concern as a sex therapist is to understand what are the barriers to a healthy sexual life. And those barriers are emotional, they're psychological, they're not just physical or sexual, right? Abuse, right? The heterosexual model, the patriarchal model of relationship is about power and control. So how are you going to feel, free or liberated or relaxed or safe or secure in your sexual life is really important. 80% of people require sex to be a place of safety, security, and relaxation. And if your partner is a threat, that you don't know if, having sex with them is going to be dangerous, right? Then you're going to avoid sex.
Yeah. Right. And also, I think the obvious thing is that you want to have sex with someone that you're in love with. And if people fall out of love with each other, then you don't have the emotional connection to want to have sex with them. And that happens sometimes.
Well, as a sex therapist, I don't think it's quite that simple. I think just like everyone has their own sexuality, also everyone has their own relationship to love and emotional intimacy and sex and sexual intimacy, and the range or the in which those two issues, sex and love, interact. Right? So some people can have sex without love, some people can have love without sex, and everything in between. And again, that is going to be dependent on all of that history, all of that indoctrination, right? All of that childhood experience, right? Is sex safe to begin with? If you've had sexual trauma, if you've had, gender-based violence, how is that going to show up in how you engage sexually? So, the love and sex equation is as variable as every human, depending on everything that we bring with us.
So you have to say sex, love, and wounds. It's not just sex or love. And yeah.
Right.
Are there favorite books that you recommend to people who want to have more vitality, variety, va-va-voom in their sexual life?
Well, again, I don't believe that it is something that can be prescribed with a set of tools. I believe that it is something that requires awareness, healing work, and that's what therapy is about. Therapy is about bringing us to states of awareness so that change can happen. Change does not happen, right, if we're not aware, if we haven't brought things into consciousness. So I can't just say, do this and your sex life will be better.
Because it's not mechanical.
It's not that. It's not about, tools. It's really about how do you free yourself into your own understanding of who you are as a sexual being. How do you own your sexuality? What are your desires? What are your sexual wounds or barriers that keep you from engaging? Right? 40% of the population is walking around with attachment wounds.
They're avoidant or something like that.
That's right, or insecure. And so they're going to bring, right, those attachment issues into their sexual lives. Tools will not address that.
Yeah, Sue Johnson says a common pattern is the woman's pursuing the man for intimacy, and he's backing off, and she's angry, and he's retrieved. So they have to understand that dynamic in order not to go into a vicious cycle.
Yes, and I don't think it's always the man or the woman who's doing those things. Sometimes the man is the pursuer, sometimes the woman is the pursuer. But again, that is about attachment. Right?
Right.
The person who pursues the other person is the one who is most afraid of abandonment. Right? Therefore, insecure about their own, status. Right? And the person who is most unavailable, right, who holds the other person, is the person who is most afraid of being overtaken. So that creates the dance. And there's always somebody in a relationship who is more insecure about abandonment versus the person who is more invested in independence. It usually is based on the gender role expectation, because that's how we indoctrinate boys and girls into their gender, right? That girls are taught to be more emotionally available, more nurturing, more empathetic, because we have a social imperative, right, to indoctrinate girls in these ways, right? Because we're indoctrinating them to be what?
Mothers.
Mothers, right? And to be a mother, you know, you have to be nurturing and emotionally available, and otherwise you'd kill your own children, right? But what we do to boys is that we indoctrinate boys to be the opposite, to be unempathetic,
Tough,
unemotional,
competitive, strong.
Well, independent, right? And so we're actually socializing boys not to attach, right? And we're socializing girls to attach. And so when we bring those, people together in a relationship, you're going to have those energies, right? But it's not necessarily always true, right? There are many men who have the attachment, wounds where they fear abandonment, and there are many women who are more avoidant and do not want to be, uh, dependent. Again, it depends on that history that overlays socialization. I call it the double whammy, right? So we have our own personal experience growing up through our childhood, right, and adolescence that impact how we interact with others and our attachment issues, and that's overlaid by the gender role expectations of dependency and independency.
What's
and
really...
so
Go ahead.
You can imagine all the permutations.
Do you know Hal and Sidra Stone voice dialogue?
I don't.
I love them. They say that in relationships, what happens is we have dominant sub-personality. It's kind of a Jungian approach, and that we tend to pick our disowned self, that kind of our opposite, and so we learn to balance. But the process of overcoming those differences, a lot of people don't know how to do it, so they don't make it. Because you're my disowned self, so that's a tension that can be very instructive and very difficult.
Right, and my basic statement to clients who come to me for relationship therapy is that you have a choice on either to make your relationship an alliance for healing, or enemy making for conflict and ultimate divorce. Right, 50% of all relationships will end in divorce. So 50% of people choose the road of non-alignment and wounding and hurting and mistrust and enemy making.
It's sad, and for them and their children. I want to talk about the men's movement. You are co-chair of NOMAS, the National Organization for Men Against Sexism. I was involved in a task group years ago and was really impressed with how much attention was paid to both organization and checking in with people's emotional states, and they really thought in terms of the whole person. So how did you get involved with NOMAS, and what have you learned from being involved with it?
Well, I kind of gave you a little bit of my history that led me to be a social justice activist.
Susan Brown Miller.
Yes. And so early on, when I was first became a father, I found NOMAS actually because they had a march for fathers and their children in Los Angeles. That was, in the early 80s, and so that was my first introduction. But what I loved about NOMAS was it was one of the first organizations, one of the first pro-feminist men's movement organizations that was intersectional, that understood that all oppressions are linked. right? That the oppression of any one group is the oppression of all of us, right? And so NOMAS is not just pro-feminist, it's anti-racist and LGBTQ affirming, with the understanding then that when we address the intersectional nature of oppression, that it enhances all of our lives, right? And that men pay a price for being oppressors as a group, right? In terms of our own humanity and our own ability to connect and empathize and attach.
And health.
Everything, sexuality, parenting, health, you name it. And so NOMAS has task groups for many of those issues. We have a feminist fathering task group. We have a men's health task group. We have a custody task group. We have a sex industry, prostitution, pornography task. We have all of those issues, all of the ways in which, we can create a society that is equitable for everyone.
What do you see in terms of young men's involvement in NOMAS and in other groups? Because of my networks, I guess, but everybody that I'm seeing in a kind of a leadership, authorship position is older, and I'm concerned about the bringing up young leaders.
Well, I'm concerned as well. NOMAS is a loose network of people across the country. We do not have any paid staff. We never have. Our mandate is to be mostly a think tank, right? In other words, to put out position papers, trainings around these issues so that we hold space for this analysis in a world that does not have this as part of our consciousness. One of the main mandates that we do have is to put on a national conference once a year, the National Conference on Men and Masculinity, which we've done for the last 46 years.
M&Ms. They're really
the
fun.
M&Ms, yes.
I like them because people dance and sing and.
That's right. All aspects of choice that all of us have is what NOMAS is about. In our previous, talk with each other before you put on the recording, you talked to me about how the men's rights movement is so focused on feeling like they're victimized by a court system that takes away custody and so on. And our analysis as a pro-feminist men's organization looks at that those issues are inherently patriarchal. It's not, the men's rights movement blames women for these custody issues. But it's not, it was never in women's hands to create a system that differentially allotted children to women versus men. It was a male-dominated system that did that. A male-dominated system that saw women in a role of childbearing and child, caretaking, and did not see men in those roles. So therefore, men were not given custody because they were not seen as capable or able to raise children. Their role was to be providers, not, raising of children. And so the court system that created this inequality that men's rights are talking about was not a system that was based in the liberation of the genders. It was a system that entrenched gender roles into law. And so they're having to deal with a system that sees them as, in those patriarchal, roles, right? And yet they blame women.
Well, they blame the courts. I think they mostly blame the courts and the political system. Yeah, you're right, because they'll blame feminist groups for influencing the legislation and the courts, yeah.
Right.
But they blame institutions, yeah.
Well, but they blame institutions as being pro-women, right? But the institutions were never pro-women, they were pro-roles.
Mm.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
So they vilify feminism, they vilify, anything that they feel takes away from their privilege or entitlement.
But to get back to the question, what do you see in terms of young men?
I'm sorry. So I think there are a lot of amazing young men who are social justice activists. Unfortunately, right, it's like, what does it take for a young man to swim upstream, basically, against the tide? This is what we're dealing with in this country, in this world, right, is that anyone who is speaking towards any of the social justice issues is swimming against the tide of a system and the institutions of that system that want to keep power and access to resources in the hands of the few. And so men are not going to be the ones who are going to, what I was reframed, that they're going to be least likely to swim against the tide because it most benefits them not to, in order for them to keep their privilege and entitlement. Right? And that's what we saw in the Trump election and everything else, right, is that, the vast majority, 75 million people who voted for a Trump administration voted for some aspect of maintaining the status quo, right? Even if it does not benefit them.
But young people didn't vote for him. So is there like outreach to young men in Nomos? Is there a task group for young men? Is there any kind of organizational connection in terms of young men's issues?
Because of our limited resources, we just put our efforts into maintaining visibility on the internet through our website, through our activities, and whoever wants to join or support, they contact us.
Well, at the last M&M, roughly, which you didn't have one in 2020, right?
We did. We had one that was totally on the web, right? It was a Zoom conference.
Wow. And could you tell, it's harder to tell on Zoom, roughly what % were young?
I can't really tell.
What about in 2019?
What Nomos has been doing roughly for the last 20 years is that we've moved into a model of conferences that collaborates with other organizations. So we show up in a local community to an organization that wants our analysis, our message, our expertise, our speakers to show up for a conference that they host. So we are doing collaborative conferences across the country. And most of our those organizations that that are aligned with us are usually domestic violence, sexual assault organizations. For example, we did 2 conferences in collaboration with the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We've done, so that's kind of where we've headed, so that we can do some more support for grassroots organizations. So it's really whoever shows up for those conferences. We're not looking for, not just saying, just show up. It's whoever is interested in whatever it is that we have to offer.
When I talked to Gordon Clay, he thought that the biggest interest was in the mythopoetic kind of spin-off, where you go to the woods and explore your inner warrior, and I think it's called New Warrior.
This is the what?
New Warrior, something like that.
Right. This is the mythopoetic movement, the men's movement, founded by Robert Bly, and yes. So, do you have a question about that?
Do you agree that it's one of the biggest current? I'm interested in the current men's movement. What's popping?
I don't know for sure. I know that pro-feminist men's movements have always been kind of small because, and because we're not necessarily attracting, the majority of men who are invested in maintaining male power, provision, entitlement. And the mythopoetic men's movement, I would say that any movement, right, that does not address, right, social justice issues of full equality of the marginalized, no matter who that marginalization is still maintaining and colluding and perpetuating patriarchy. And so the mythopoetic men's movement has basically said that, yes, men living in patriarchy pay a price to their own emotional well-being, but it's not, but the way to do that is to, go out into the woods with other men and explore other ways of showing up as men, as in your masculinity, not addressing really the gender inequality, the injustices in our system. So they're not really, addressing those social justice issues.
Have you heard of a group called Everyman, where they counsel men and have groups?
No, I have not.
I think their focus is on, they counsel men how to be more successful. I think that's what it is. How to win more.
Right. That's not surprising. It's not unique. There are all kinds of, groups, organizations, affiliations, mostly in what's called the manosphere, online on the internet, that includes any of the men's rights, the incel movement, all the men who are teaching other men how to conquer women sexually. The biggest overarching label is the manosphere.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Yeah, just Google manosphere.
Okay.
And just see all the various permutations of male rights activism, right? Men who are working against feminism, maintaining sexism and misogyny as part of their identification, right? That women are the threat to male power, to male rights, to right.
What a concern that I've heard from a lot of the men that I've talked with is that more women now are graduating from college and going to grad school, and there's a concern that boys are disadvantaged in school and left behind. And that the college graduation rate is around the world except sub-Saharan Africa. So I wondered what you think is going on, that the boys aren't going to college as much as girls.
Well, I think it's also part of male indoctrination into our culture. Again, let's look at patriarchy as the source of these issues. Let's not look at, the liberation of women as the source of this issue. This stuff starts at birth. When you are born, they look between your legs, and if you've got a penis, you are sent on that trajectory, right?
It's blue.
And it's blue, the blue trajectory. And if you have a vulva, then you are sent in that other trajectory.
Okay.
And so we know, right, that masculinity, the indoctrination to masculinity, is about non-emotionality, right? Not being not vulnerable. What we would call all the issues of toxic masculinity, right? All the ways in which boys are indoctrinated to have to hold up to certain gender expectations. And you just, you mentioned a whole bunch of those: competitive and strong and unemotional and angry and, not ask for directions, and big boys don't cry, and you name it, right?
Winners, be competitive.
Right. I've done this with my clients. It's, people do it all over the world. It's called the man in the box. It's all of the gender role expectations that a man has to uphold in order for him to feel safe and secure in his body and his manhood. But what that does is it also teaches boys, right, that to be studious, to be interested in in education and all of those things is not masculine. We are teaching boys that those things are not masculine.
But that changed, because it used to be that men were the large majority of people in higher education. So
that's right, because then women were excluded, right? Before the 1970s, women were excluded, right, by policy, right, from higher education, from certain careers, right?
Law school, med school, yeah.
All of those things, right? But what is keeping boys from, now competing in the educational system is, are we supporting education as something that is okay within the male role?
It's always been okay to be good in science and math if you're a boy, right?
Yeah, and so there are certain career tracks even now that are very limited to women, including, the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So the system is biased, but it's biased in a patriarchal, sexist way. So girls are still limited from traditional male role careers, and men keep themselves out of traditional female careers, right? In other words, research shows that men would prefer to be unemployed than take a job in the service professions. Right? But if your education as a boy is focused on sports and
being in a band, is sexy.
Whatever, right? Then what is that going to say to you about the humanities, about, I don't know, you know, uh, what are the careers that women are graduating in? What are the careers that men are graduating in? And what are the issues that keep men from going into higher education, other than into the STEM careers, which are also highly competitive?
Right.
So, but you see, the men's rights movement blames women for those issues again. They blame a female-dominated educational system for somehow doing something to boys that they don't do to girls, and I don't buy that.
Mm. Recently, I interviewed two men in their early 20s, and they both said, even these young men, that when they were in middle school, they got all kinds of messages about what not to be as in terms of masculine, but it wasn't clear really what to be. But you knew you weren't supposed to be a sissy or like a girl. So they said it was really very difficult time, that middle school time, in terms of trying to figure out who am I.
That's right. And um, that is the nature of our system, right? That is the initiation into gender, that it does start at birth. By 6-year-old, right, boys have learned to dumb down themselves emotionally. We have research that shows that. By 6 years old, girls have learned that they are less than than boys. So they stop raising their hands in classrooms. They start, which they have done up till then. And then at puberty, right, it's kind of like the hit, right? Girls learn that they have to dumb themselves down, that they have to be interested in feminine things, that they can't compete with boys, that, and how to be sexual objects. And boys learn, right, how to be, what is the version of masculinity that they have to learn in order to reap the rewards of the system and not get the punishment, right? Not get the bullying, right?
Don't you think that's changing now that girls are much more outspoken and ambitious than before, like when we were kids?
I think it's showing up differently, but it's still part of the same system.
What do you mean it's showing up differently?
I think the pressures are different. And I think women get mixed messages too.
What I see, there's showing increasing rates of adolescent anxiety and depression, especially in girls. I don't know if that's because boys don't talk about it, but what I see is, like, some people like Jean Twenge blame social media, but I think it's the pressure to compete, to get into college, to be attractive, to appeal, to date. Girls have all those pressures to achieve, and they're told you can be anything you want to be. So I think there's a lot of pressure from that kind of expectation. So your thoughts?
Well, I think most of the research is showing that the pressure is around, that social peer pressure around objectification, sexualization of girls at those ages, right? The pressure to be attractive, desirable, right? That you are valued for how you look rather than than who you are, and that is maximized in social media. And so if you don't fit, right, this, let's say, image, right, of girlhood or womanhood, right, you are out, you are ostracized. And that pressure is coming a lot from boys and men, right?
Well, girls are getting into university more, so they've gotten the message that they should achieve academically.
Perhaps.
Why do you think that teen, adolescent anxiety and depression is increasing? I'm really concerned about that.
I think this is the same concern, right? Which is social media and how it perpetuates patriarchal norms and gender role expectations.
So the fact that men die younger, are less likely to seek help, go to a doctor, married men do better because their wife says, honey, go get a checkup. Mm-hmm. Do you think that impacts boys as well?
Yes, it starts there. It's the same issue. If you can't be vulnerable, if you have to be strong and powerful and can't be weak, then that means that you have to be non-pulsed and you have to not show pain, all of that. That means that you can't, you're you are unlikely to then show up to seek help, whether it's a doctor or a therapist or another human being. And therefore, the statistics show that men die younger because they don't seek help for preventable issues that become, deadly by the time they do seek help, right? And that that there's a higher level of risk taking in boys and men as ways to prove their masculinity. So, and the other issue is male suicide is much higher across the board, because if you can't, share, if you can't be vulnerable, and you have to hold on to your struggle, your pain, your depression, your mental health issues, suicide is an isolation issue. Mm. The more isolated you are, the more likely you are to commit suicide, because, right, you believe that no one is there for you, no one cares about you. And so hypermasculinity, right, our version of masculinity is inherently isolating of boys and men.
Do you think that there's any progress? I mean, the whole Trump administration was really discouraging. But then Biden seems to present this image of caring and compassion and being in touch with his feelings. So, do you think have any hope?
Well, I always have hope. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. Yeah. But I also believe that this requires systemic change. This is not something that can be done by an election. This has to be done through policy, through upending our whole educational system, upending, white supremacy and male supremacy and straight supremacy, right? And that's what Nomos is about, right? That it requires we will never have, right, a liberated social justice focused equality system without the dominating groups being allies to the marginalized. So nomos is about men showing up in support of the women's movement so that men can be a force in helping women, get equality and ease women's lives, right? The same way that it requires white people to show up as allies to, to the civil rights movement, right? So in order for us to engage in movements of equality so that everyone's lives are, supported and eased. And so, and that's what it would take for systemic change.
I think it's useful to have models, and to me, I always look to Nordic countries because they do more for gender equality. Do you agree that they're more progressive and a model?
Yes, I do. And notice, right, what did they do? They created those changes through national policies.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They put these things
Like
into law.
parental leave, childcare, elder care that was affordable. Yeah.
That's right. Not just that, right? But the Nordic model around prostitution, um, it's just in terms of workplace policies, you name it. That's what it takes. It takes a concerted effort, as it will take a concerted effort to stop climate change, right? It will take a concerted effort to stop oppression in this world.
Do you think that Israel is a model in terms of women serving in the military? Does that make a difference in attitudes towards women that they serve, do you think?
From the little I know, because I, have not, interacted with Israeli policy, that in Israel, the military has become an equalizing force in society, in integrating the genders and racial and ethnicities, right? People, it's kind of like a cauldron, right, in which people get to interact rather than to live, in separate lives not in touch with. I mean, one of the main factors of what I read about racism in America is that, the communities don't intermix, right? You can grow up in a only white community and never see another person of color unless they're somebody who is, a worker of some sort.
Yeah. What was I going to say? So it is hopeful that we have the Nordic countries, but they're kind of a special homogeneous population. So, but as you said at the beginning, it's about doing what each individual person can do, and you're working one person at a time.
Well, I'm also working for systemic change,
yeah.
but,
yeah, hence nomos. Do you have anything else that you would like people to know about patriarchy, men's, women's roles, marital satisfaction, sex, anything?
Just to understand that we live in a system that has modified everyone's behavior in the name of what is considered normal, right? So we've all been indoctrinated into that program, right? That rewards certain behaviors and punishes others. And that system is gendered, is racialized, is and so that becomes the template for with which people compare their lives. And the work is to undo that, right? To understand it, to become aware of it, and to participate in work that in liberation work, which is what feminism is.
And that's what consciousness raising groups did in the 60s and 70s, but I don't hear about them very much anymore.
Right.
We need them. I'm asking people, do you know your Myers-Briggs, Keirsey, and Bates score?
My Myers-Briggs is INFJ.
And then I'm going to thank you. I'm going to turn off the recorder.